The final bell didn't set us free. It marked the end of safety. Inside school, we were equals, partners, peers, even friends. Outside, the streets were a classroom of their own, where every glance, every step, every handhold was judged before we even spoke. Love wasn't the challenge. The real lesson was surviving the world that wasn't built for us. And that lesson began the moment we stepped through the door. The final bell of the afternoon did not ring like a liberation. It tolled like a warning, signaling the expiration of the amnesty we had been granted for exactly 6 hours and 45 minutes. In the hallway, amidst the chaotic symphony of slamming lockers and scuffing sneakers, there was a suspended reality where the only thing that mattered was the hierarchy of grades and the social currency of who sat where at lunch. Here, inside the brick-and-mortar sanctuary of the institution, we were merely students, defined by our intellect and our uniforms. But I knew something she did not yet fully grasp. I knew that the moment our feet crossed the threshold of the main entrance, the invisible armor of the school crest would dissolve. The uniform, which acted as a great equalizer under the fluorescent hum of the classroom lights, would lose its power the instant the sun hit our faces. Inside, we were a pair. Outside, we were a provocation. We walked together toward the double doors, the heavy glass pane acting as a portal between two distinct dimensions. I watched her profile as she laughed at something trivial, perhaps a comment about the history assignment or the absurdity of the cafeteria menu. She moved with a lightness that I envied, a buoyancy born of the assumption that the world was built for her comfort. She did not scan the perimeter. She did not check the eye lines of the adults loitering by the bus stop. She simply existed, occupying space with the confident negligence of someone who has never been told they are trespassing simply by breathing. I, however, was already tightening my muscles, preparing for the inevitable shift in atmospheric pressure. I adjusted my backpack, feeling the straps dig into my shoulders, grounding me in the physical reality of what was about to happen. I was transitioning from a scholar to a suspect, from a partner to a problem, and the tragedy was that she thought we were just walking home. As we pushed open the doors, the humidity of the city rushed in to meet us, carrying with it the smell of exhaust, heated asphalt, and judgment. The noise of the street was a cacophony that drowned out the private, quiet language we had cultivated between second and third period. We stepped onto the sidewalk, and the bubble popped. It was not a violent explosion, but a subtle, suffocating shift in the air. I saw it happen in real time. A woman waiting for the crosswalk light shifted her purse to the other shoulder as we approached. A car slowed down just a fraction of a second too long, the driver's gaze lingering not on us as individuals, but on the geometry of our proximity. They were doing the math of us, calculating the variables of race and class, and finding the equation unbalanced. I instinctively put a foot of distance between us, a defensive maneuver learned through years of silent conditioning. She looked at me, confused, her hand reaching out to bridge the gap I had just created, and I had to make the split-second decision to let her hand fall or to grab it and declare war on the neighborhood. This is the counterstory to the romance novels they sell in the library. In those stories, the obstacle is usually a misunderstanding or a rival suitor. In our story, the antagonist was the pavement itself. It was the architecture of a society designed to keep our zip codes separate. I looked at her, standing there in the afternoon sun, her tie slightly askew, completely oblivious to the fact that her innocence was a luxury item I could not afford. She smiled, waiting for me to say something, to continue the conversation about the future, about college, about U.S. But the us that existed in the chemistry lab evaporated here. I could feel the eyes of the shopkeeper across the street, the passive aggression of the passers-by who viewed our companionship as an act of rebellion rather than a natural occurrence. The silence that stretched between us wasn't empty. It was heavy with the things I couldn't say without shattering her worldview. I realized then that to love her was to educate her, and to educate her was to hurt her, to strip away that beautiful blindness that allowed her to hold my hand without fear. The bell had rung. School was out, and the real curriculum was about to begin. The pavement radiated a heat that felt personal, a stark contrast to the sterile, regulated cool of the hallway we had just left behind. As we moved further away from the brick facade of the high school, the invisible force field that protected our naive affection began to thin, dissolving into the humid city air. We were walking toward the bus stop, a mundane pilgrimage for hundreds of students, yet for us, the journey felt like crossing a minefield without a map. She was talking about an upcoming history project, her voice light and unencumbered, dancing over topics with the casual confidence of someone who has never been made to feel that their presence is a disturbance to the peace. I listened, nodding at the appropriate intervals, but my attention was split, fractured by the necessities of survival that she had the privilege to ignore. This is the first installment of what we call the black tax, a concept that goes far beyond economics and bleeds into the emotional currency of daily existence. It is the cognitive overhead required to navigate a world that views your existence as conditional. While she was free to focus entirely on the nuances of the French Revolution, I was paying a surcharge on my attention span, scanning the street for potential threats, monitoring the volume of my laughter, and calibrating the speed of my gait to ensure I appeared neither too hurried nor too loitering. It is an exhaustion that settles deep in the marrow, a weary vigilance that acts as a tariff on joy. We decided to stop at a small corner cafe, a place with vintage awnings and the smell of roasted beans that promised a temporary sanctuary. As I held the door open for her, a middle-aged couple exiting the shop paused, their eyes lingering on me for a fraction of a second too long. It was not a glare, exactly, but a micro-assessment, a quick mental calculation of whether I belonged in the frame of their afternoon. I saw the shift in their posture, the slight clutching of a purse, the narrowing of the eyes that precedes judgment. She walked past them without a glance, smiling at me, completely oblivious to the silent interaction that had just taken place. This was the dynamic that would come to define us, her moving through the world as if it were a garden built for her leisure, and me moving through it as if it were a museum where I was forbidden to touch the exhibits. We sat at a booth near the window, the sunlight illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, creating a tableau of teenage romance that looked perfect from the outside. But inside, the tension was tightening my chest. I ordered a coffee, making sure to articulate my words with excessive clarity, pitching my voice to a register that signaled safety and education, another payment of the tax. I had to perform respectability before I could even take a sip of water. She ordered with a casual slur of words, unconcerned with how she was perceived, resting in the luxury of being the default setting of humanity. It was in that booth, watching her trace the condensation on her glass, that I realized our relationship was not just a merging of hearts, but a collision of realities. I knew then that if we were to continue, if we were to survive the erosion of the world outside the school gates, I would have to introduce her to the curriculum that no textbook dared to print. There were 3 specific lessons, 3 distinct stories from my life that served as pillars of my reality, which I had kept hidden in the darker corners of my memory. These were not pleasant anecdotes to share over iced coffee. They were the receipts of the tax I paid daily. I looked at her, seeing the openness in her face, the terrifying trust she placed in the world, and I felt a profound sadness. To love her meant I had to break that trust. I had to open a loop in her mind that could never be closed, exposing her to the machinery of a society that was designed to separate us. I thought of the first lesson, the time I learned that the law is applied differently depending on the zip code of your skin. I thought of the second lesson, the unspoken code of conduct required to survive a dinner party in a neighborhood that didn't want you there. And I thought of the third, the most painful lesson of all, which was how to shrink yourself so others can feel big. These 3 narratives sat on the tip of my tongue, heavy and acidic. I knew that once I spoke them, once I pulled back the curtain, the innocence of this afternoon would be gone forever. We would no longer be just 2 kids in love, we would be conspirators in a rebellion against the status quo. The open loop was formed. I took a breath, the weight of the coming conversation settling on my shoulders like a physical load. I had to tell her. I had to show her the receipts. Because without understanding the tax, she would never understand the cost of loving me. The library at St. Jude's was a cathedral of silence, a cavernous hall where the dust motes danced in shafts of golden afternoon light that pierced through stained glass windows, illuminating the heavy oak tables where we sat. It was here, amidst the scent of decaying paper and floor wax, that the first pillar of my defense strategy began to take shape, though at the time I simply called it survival. I watched her from across the table, her head bent over a chemistry textbook, a stray lock of hair falling effortlessly across her cheek. She studied with a casual grace, a relaxed posture that suggested failure was an abstract concept she had read about but never experienced. For her, this institution was a playground for the mind, a place to explore and grow. For me, it was a courtroom where I was perpetually on trial, and the verdict hung on every quiz, every essay, every perfectly knotted tie. I looked down at my own notes, transcribed in handwriting so precise it looked like type, the margins justified, the ink black and unforgiving. This was the defense of excellence, the first and most exhausting layer of the armor I wore. It is a concept that is often celebrated as ambition or drive, but in the context of the counterstory, it is revealed to be a trauma response masked as success. The world tells us that if we just work hard enough, if we are just smart enough, the gates will open. But the truth I lived was different. I learned early that mediocrity is a privilege I could not afford. To be average was to be invisible at best, and dangerous at worst. I had to be undeniable. I had to build a citadel of achievements so high and so fortified that no one could question my right to occupy space in this room. I remembered a specific Tuesday, 3 weeks prior, which served as the cornerstone of this realization. It was in Mr. Sterling's English literature class, a room that smelled of chalk dust and old tweed. We had been assigned to write an analysis of The Great Gatsby, dissecting the American dream. I had poured 20 hours into that paper, obsessing over every semicolon, ensuring that my vocabulary was sophisticated but not pretentious, finding that impossible balance between deference and insight. When Mr. Sterling handed back the papers, he placed hers on her desk with a smile and a nod. An ominous, "Good work." When he came to my desk, the air in the room seemed to thin. He did not smile. He held my paper in his hand for a moment too long, his thumb resting over the red A+ circled at the top. He leaned down, his voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper that carried the weight of an accusation. He asked if I had received help with this. He asked if these were my words. In that split second, the difference between us was laid bare. Her excellence was expected. Mine was suspect. Her intelligence was a natural trait. Mine was a potential deception. I had to defend my excellence on the spot, citing my sources from memory, explaining my thesis with a calm precision that masked the pounding of my heart. I had to litigate my own intellect before the bell rang. This is the hidden cost that I needed her to understand as we sat in that library. I needed her to see that when I straightened my blazer, when I double-checked the pronunciation of a word before speaking, when I refused to skip class even once, it wasn't because I was a stiff or a bore. It was because I was walking a tightrope over a canyon. One slip, one moment of acting out, one unpolished interaction, and the narrative would shift instantly from brilliant student to problem child. The defense of excellence requires a constant, low-level hypervigilance that drains the soul. It means you can never truly rest. You can never just be a boy in love, distracted and messy. You must be an ambassador for your entire race, every hour of every day. I looked at her again, seeing the ease in her shoulders, the way she chewed on the end of her pen, completely unaware of the politics of her own existence. She loved me for my mind, she said. She loved how articulate I was, how composed I remained under pressure. She did not know that my composition was a cage. She did not know that the excellence she admired was actually a shield I was too afraid to put down. If I told her this, would it break the spell? Would she look at my straight A's and see them not as trophies, but as scar tissue? The defense of excellence is a lonely pillar because it isolates you from your peers who don't have to try as hard, and it isolates you from those who gave up because the pressure was too great. I was stranded on an island of perfectionism, watching her float in the warm sea of accepted mediocrity. I wanted to reach out and hold her hand across the table, to bridge the gap between the boy who had to be perfect and the girl who just had to be. But the library rules forbade public displays of affection, and I, the architect of my own prison, would never dream of breaking a rule. I turned a page in my notebook, the sound loud in the quiet room, and continued to study for a test I had already passed. securing the perimeter of a life that felt less like living and more like waiting for an inevitable attack. The gravel crunching beneath the tires of my second-hand sedan sounded aggressively loud in the hush of her neighborhood, a tree-leaned sanctuary where the silence was not empty but expensive. We had left the neutral ground of the school library, a place where intellect was the only currency that mattered, and were now crossing the border into a territory where pedigree outweighed potential. This was the second pillar of my existence, the mechanism that allowed me to breathe in atmospheres not designed for my lungs. I called it the internal volume knob. As I put the car in park, I felt the phantom dial in the center of my chest, the one that controlled the amplitude of my being. I reached for the door handle and simultaneously reached inside myself to turn everything down. The bass in my voice needed to be leveled out to a non-threatening baritone. The width of my gestures needed to be constricted to the space immediately in front of my torso. The brightness of my laughter had to be dimmed to a polite chuckle. This was not a betrayal of self, though she would often interpret it that way. It was a strategic modulation, a survival tactic honed over generations of men who learned that being too loud, too large, or too present could invite swift and terrible corrections from a world that preferred us in the background. She looked at me from the passenger seat, her eyes bright with the expectation of an evening spent with a boy she knew, the one who debated philosophy with animated hands and laughed with his whole body. She did not understand that he had to wait in the car. The boy who walked up the driveway to meet her parents was a curated exhibit, a polished stone that offered no jagged edges for society to snag on. Walking through the front door of her home, the air changed immediately, becoming cooler and scented with polished wood and lilies. Her father met us in the foyer, a man whose handshake was a test of character and whose smile was an assessment of threat. I engaged the protocol immediately. My spine stiffened, not out of pride, but to reduce the target surface area. I spoke only when spoken to, and my answers were concise, grammatically flawless, and devoid of slang or regional inflection. This is the exhausting labor of the volume knob. It requires a constant background processing power to audit every thought before it becomes a word, stripping away any cultural markers that might confuse or alarm the host. To her, I appeared stiff. I could see the confusion knitting her brow as we moved to the dining room. She nudged my elbow as we sat, a silent plea for me to relax, to be the person who had charmed her between periods. But she did not realize that relaxation was a luxury afforded only to those who owned the space. I was renting my presence here, paying in the currency of conformity, and the rent was due every second. The dinner conversation drifted toward local politics and golf, subjects chosen to test my assimilation. I navigated them like a bomb disposal technician, clipping the right wires, nodding at the right intervals, ensuring that nothing I said could be construed as radical or ungrateful. Midway through the meal, the pressure of the modulation began to manifest as a physical ache behind my eyes. It is a specific type of fatigue known only to those who must constantly translate their souls into a language acceptable to the majority. I watched her eat, her movements fluid and unthinking. She laughed loudly at a joke her mother made, throwing her head back, her fork clattering against the china. No one flinched. No one checked the door. No one worried that her laughter was taking up too much room. It was a display of freedom so casual, so utter, that it made my heart ache with a mixture of adoration and envy. She lived at full volume because the world had been equalized for her frequency. When I finally allowed myself a small laugh, it was a carefully calibrated sound, measured to ensure it did not disrupt the ambient noise floor of the room. She looked at me then, a flash of disappointment in her eyes. She thought I was being distant. She thought I was withholding myself from her family because I didn't like them, or worse, that I was ashamed of who I was. The tragedy of the internal volume knob is that it protects the body while eroding the intimacy. It creates a glass wall between you and the people you love, who cannot hear the scream trapped behind the polite smile. As the evening wound down and we stood on the porch saying our goodbyes, the tension in my shoulders began to unspool, but the damage was done. Her father clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture of approval for the performance, not the person. I had passed the inspection. I had remained within the acceptable decibel range of existence. But as we walked back to the car, the silence between us was heavy. She felt the gap, the hollow space where my personality should have been. She didn't say it, but I could hear the question loud in the quiet night. Who are you really? The answer was complicated. I was both the vibrant boy in the library and the silent statue at the dinner table. One was who I was, the other was how I survived. And until she understood that the volume knob wasn't a choice but a requirement, society would always be the third person in our relationship, its hand hovering over the dial, ready to mute me the moment I forgot my place. The scent of cedar shavings and stale pipe tobacco always signaled a suspension of modern time in my grandfather's workshop. It was a sanctuary built from the discarded remnants of a world that had tried to break him. A small room at the back of the house where the air was thick with dust motes that hung suspended in shafts of afternoon sunlight like microscopic histories waiting to be inhaled. I had come here not for comfort, but for the architecture of survival that he had painstakingly constructed over 8 decades of navigating a landscape that preferred him silent. He sat in his wingback chair, the leather cracked and worn in the exact shape of his spine, his hands resting on the head of a cane carved from black walnut. He did not look up when I entered. He was watching the dust dance, perhaps counting the years each particle represented. I needed to understand the mechanics of the transition I was attempting. The perilous leap from the school hallway where I was a peer to the street corner where I was a suspect. He was the architect of my survival strategies, the man who taught me how to tie a tie so perfect it acted as a shield against skepticism, and how to stand so still that I became invisible to the police cruisers patrolling our block. When I finally spoke, my voice felt too thin for the room, bouncing off the shelves of encyclopedias he had bought door-to-door in 1950. Books that claimed to hold the sum of human knowledge but contained no mention of men like him. I told him about her. I told him about the silence in the car and the volume knob I could not stop adjusting. I expected him to smile, to offer a generic platitude about young love being a battlefield or to tease me about my nervousness. Instead, he slowly turned his head, his eyes milky with age but terrifyingly sharp, and asked a question that sucked the oxygen out of the room. He asked if I understood the cost of the ticket I was trying to buy. This was not about romance to him, it was about economics, the brutal transaction of dignity exchanged for proximity. He began to speak, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder, outlining the history of the invisible wall that separated my world from hers. He told me that in his time, the danger was physical, a closed fist or a slammed door or a sign in a window. But for me, he explained, the danger was psychological. It was the seductive lie that the wall had vanished simply because I was allowed to stand near it. He leaned forward, the wood of his cane creaking under the pressure of his grip, and told me that she might love me, yes. He did not doubt her heart, for hearts are naive organs. But he doubted her vision. He explained that she had never been forced to study the blueprints of society just to walk through it. She moved through the world like water, fluid and unobstructed, assuming the shape of whatever vessel she poured herself into. I, on the other hand, moved through it like a glaciologist, constantly testing the ice, listening for the crack that would swallow me whole. This was the intergenerational link, the passing of the torch not of triumph, but of vigilance. He recounted a story from his own youth, a moment of forgotten tenderness with a woman whose world was forbidden to him, and how the harsh light of reality had shattered it not with malice, but with the cold indifference of a system designed to keep them apart. He was not telling me to leave her. He was telling me that to love her required a specific kind of armor he had spent a lifetime forging. He stood up then, a slow, painful unfolding of limbs that sounded like dry branches snapping, and walked to the window. He pointed to the street below, where the world went about its business, oblivious to the history watching from above. He told me that my love was a rebellion, whether I intended it to be or not. And rebellions, he whispered, require strategy, not just passion. The mentor had spoken. The lesson was not how to court her, but how to survive the courtship without losing the self I had fought so hard to construct. The volume knob was not just a tool for the dinner table. It was an inheritance, a piece of technology developed in the laboratories of Jim Crow and updated for the era of colorblind hypocrisy. He placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, the weight of it grounding me to the floorboards. He told me that I had to be bilingual. I had to speak the language of my heart to her, and the language of survival to the world. And I could never, ever confuse the two. If I did, I would be consumed. The room seemed to darken as the sun dipped below the horizon, the shadows stretching out from his chair to touch my feet. I realized then that I was not just dating a girl. I was negotiating a peace treaty between two warring realities, and my grandfather was the only diplomat who had read the fine print. He sent me away with a nod, a silent dismissal that said the lesson was over, and the test was about to begin. I walked out of the workshop carrying a heavier load than when I entered. The romance had been stripped of its naivety. I now understood that every time I held her hand in public, I was spending the capital he had saved. I was cashing in the checks of his endurance. It was a terrifying responsibility. To love her was to owe him. To fail her was to fail him. The link was forged, and the chain was heavy. The rain had turned the city into a blurred watercolor painting as viewed from the interior of the St. Clair Bistro, a place where the menu did not list prices and the silence was heavy enough to be weighed on a scale. We had chosen this location not for the food, but as a deliberate exercise in occupying space, a test of the perimeter that my grandfather had warned me about. The maitre d' had seated us in the center of the room, perhaps hoping to make an example of our audacity, or perhaps simply because the corner tables were reserved for people who did not need to prove they belonged. I sat across from her, watching the candlelight dance in the reflection of her eyes, trying to ignore the subtle shift in atmospheric pressure that occurred whenever a waiter walked past our table without making eye contact. This was the fourth pillar of our existence, the phase I came to call the receipts. It was the moment where the romantic abstraction of our love had to be reconciled against the hard, cold ledger of societal expectation. In this room, surrounded by the clinking of silver against fine china and the low hum of conversations that likely determined the fate of small companies, we were being audited. Every glance from a neighboring table was a line item questioning our solvency as a couple. The older couple to our left, draped in pearls and tweed, watched us with a gaze that was less curiosity and more of a forensic investigation. They were looking for the cracks. They were waiting for the voice to raise too loud, for the manners to slip, for the confirmation that the experiment had failed. I felt the familiar heat rising in my chest, the ancient biological urge to defend, to stand up and demand recognition, but I remembered the workshop and the shadows stretching across the floor. Anger was expensive. Outbursts were a tax I could not afford to pay. Instead, I reached for the water glass, observing the condensation sliding down the crystal, and I engaged in the silent work of counter-storytelling. The world told a story that we were a mismatch, a glitch in the social software that needed to be patched out. But I held the receipts. I looked at her, really looked at her, and I catalogued the evidence that contradicted their narrative. I thought of the way she laughed at my terrible puns when no one was watching, the way she knew exactly how I took my coffee without asking, the shared language of silence we had built over months of library study sessions. These were the receipts. These were the documented moments of human connection that rendered the external judgment invalid. The receipts were the data points of our intimacy, the irrefutable proof that what we had was not a performance for their benefit, but a reality that existed independent of their approval. I realized then that the anger I felt was actually misplaced. It shouldn't have been directed at them for judging us, but rather at the tragedy of their own blindness. They were looking at a masterpiece and seeing only the frame. When the waiter finally approached, his demeanor was stiff, a study in reluctant service. He placed the specials menu on the table with a crisp snap, his eyes hovering somewhere above my hairline. He asked if we would be paying together or separate, a standard question that, in this context, felt loaded with the presumption of impermanence. It was a microaggression wrapped in protocol. I paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to be noticeable, a tactical delay to reclaim the rhythm of the interaction. I looked him directly in the eye, offering a smile that didn't reach my defenses but signaled total control. Together, I said, my voice dropping an octave, calm and resonant. I did not explain. I did not justify. I simply stated the fact of our union. In that moment, I wasn't just paying for dinner, I was settling the account. I was showing them the receipt of our solidarity. The waiter blinked, his script disrupted by my refusal to be rattled, and he retreated into the shadows of the kitchen. She reached across the table and touched my hand, her fingers cool against my skin. She didn't say anything, but the squeeze of her hand acknowledged the battle that had just been fought and won without a single weapon being drawn. We ate our meal in the center of the room, surrounded by eyes that eventually grew bored of their surveillance. The tension dissolved not because the world had changed, but because we had stopped negotiating with it. We had done the math. We had balanced the books. We knew that the cost of their prejudice was their burden to carry, not ours. We possessed the moral victory, the logical win. As we walked out into the cool night air, the rain clearing up to reveal the slick, shining pavement, I felt lighter. The receipt was in my pocket, both literally and metaphorically. We had walked through the fire of the public gaze and came out not just unscorched, but tempered. We had proven that the hierarchy was a fragility, and our love was the stone. The iron gates had begun to rust, shedding flakes of orange oxidation onto the pavement where we once stood waiting for the liberating chime of the 3 o'clock bell. 10 years had passed since we walked these grounds as students, 10 years since we traded the structured safety of the classroom for the chaotic, unregulated wilderness of the real world. We stood there now, not as the frightened children who hid their affection in the margins of textbooks, but as the architects of a life that many said could not be built. The wind bit at our cheeks, carrying the familiar scent of old asphalt and damp earth, a sensory trigger that immediately transported me back to a time when our biggest worry should have been calculus, but was instead the existential threat of being seen. This building, this towering structure of red brick and institutional glass, had been our paradox. It was a prison of rules and schedules, yet it was the only place we were truly free. Inside these walls, under the fluorescent hum of the library lights, we were just students. We were minds to be molded, not demographics to be divided. The school bell gave us permission to exist side by side, our proximity justified by seating charts and group projects. But the moment we stepped past this gate, the bubble popped. The permission expired. We were thrust into a society that demanded we pick a side, a society that viewed our clasped hands not as a gesture of romance, but as an act of political defiance. Returning here, standing on the precipice of our history, I realized the final lesson was never written on a chalkboard. It was the realization that the bubble was not a sanctuary given to us, it was a training ground we had survived. We looked at the empty courtyard, populated now only by the ghosts of our younger selves. I could see us there, sitting on the concrete bench, knees touching under the table, terrified that the world would tear us apart. I wanted to yell across the decade to those two kids. I wanted to tell them that the fear they felt was not a weakness, but an alert system. The world did try to tear us apart. It tried with subtle exclusions, with the soft bigotry of low expectations, and with the aggressive silence of disapproval in public spaces. We had spent years navigating the minefield of the black tax, paying double the emotional labor for half the recognition, constantly auditing our behavior to ensure we gave no ammunition to those who wanted to see us fail. We had become masters of the counter-narrative, experts in the unspoken language of survival. But looking at the school now, I felt the weight of those receipts finally lift. The defense of excellence was no longer a shield we had to hold up, it was simply who we were. We didn't need to code switch anymore because we had written our own language. The hierarchy that loomed so large over us back then, the terrifying monolithic force of societal expectation, now seemed small, almost quaint, like the rusted gate before us. We had outgrown the need for their approval. The final lesson was that their power only existed as long as we negotiated with it. We had stopped negotiating. The silence of the Sunday afternoon amplified the clarity of the moment. I looked at you, the gray starting to touch your temples, the lines of resilience etched around your eyes. You were no longer the boy who snuck notes into my locker. You were the man who stood immovable when the world pushed. We had built a fortress not out of bricks, but out of shared understanding and unyielding dignity. The love story wasn't about the romance of the forbidden, it was about the endurance of the inevitable. We were inevitable. Society was the variable. We were the constant. As we turned away from the gate, leaving the school behind us for the last time, I realized we weren't leaving our memories. We were freeing them. We were taking the love that was born in captivity, and allowing it to finally breathe the air of absolute liberty. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched out before us, no longer looming over us, but paving the way forward. We walked down the street, our footsteps echoing in a rhythm that belonged only to us, no longer marching to the sound of a bell, but moving to the steady, unshakable beat of our own triumphant hearts.